Welcome, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be back here with John Vervaeke and Daniel Zaruba. I'm Johannes Niederhaus, of anyone who's perhaps coming over here from John's channel or Daniel's channels. So we started a series late last year, early this year, I don't quite remember, on the forums, and much has come from it so far. And before, though, we continue, this is dialogue number 5. Before we continue and begin here with a different direction, I'd like to invite you to briefly, maybe to introduce yourself. John.
So I'm John Vervaeke. I'm Associate Professor of Cognitive Psychology and Cognitive Science at the University of Toronto. I'm the author of the YouTube series Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. I also do 2 other ongoing series, Voices with Vervaeke, and the Cognitive Science Show, in which I've done a bunch of shows, a bunch of people on the nature of the self, on the nature of consciousness. So if you have a particular cognitive scientific bent, that's a channel to a playlist to check out. And I have an ongoing interest, both theoretical and praxeological, in trying to bring back a lived and practiced form of post-nominalistic, post-enlightenment Neoplatonism, because I think it is a valuable courtyard for building these kinds of deep communicative connections. And part of that work has been working with Johannes and Daniel. And so a great pleasure to be here again. Daniel.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Daniel. I've been on Johannes' channel a couple of times. I was in Johannes' first course with Idleness with Dignity. And then I just was in many of his courses. And then Johannes was so, he graciously gave me the opportunity also to teach some of the things I'm interested in. So that's Japanese philosophy, especially I like Nishitani Keiji, whose masterpiece is Religion Nothingness. We did a course last year on that, and we also did a course in the spring where we tried to bridge some of the emerging practices in our corner of the internet, together with just philosophical text work and discussion. And yeah, that's also why I'm here, and I hope we can discuss continue our very fruitful discussion.
Yes, so we've done 4, I think, and I think this is the 5th one.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah. And what I will do is link to every single one of them, because they're on different channels. And so anyone who's just coming in now can maybe go back to some of them, or maybe even all of them, and see the trajectory. And I thought perhaps, because there was a bit of a break in between because of travel and other things, and conferences and all these things that are coming back now. What I started thinking about, coming from our last dialogue, I said something to the effect of real Platonism has never been tried. And that was, of course, I could easily say it was said half jokingly, etc. But I thought perhaps that what we could do now is go into a bit of a mode of radical self-critique and look through, or perhaps some of the not pitfalls, but the I would almost say perhaps some of the dangers that could also, which has, and for me it's difficult to articulate this because it has a lot of presuppositions in terms of how I think of our time. One of the issues with a statement such as this is, of course, that Platonism is it just another sort of ism that we arbitrarily pick from the shelf? That's something that we also talked about. What are the forms? Where are they? In which sense do they appear to us? And of course, one could also say that perhaps what, in terms of Plato's philosophy, even if there is a hidden Plato, the Plato which is maybe the Plato from the Parmenides dialogue, the question is how could that be brought back into the discourse, or has it actually just run its course? And it has run its course as the Plato that has run its course is the Plato of the chorismos, of the let's say the two-world Plato. That even if that wasn't his intention, that is what philosophy has to deal with it seemingly again and again, the chorismos between a visible and an intelligible world. That's as far as the West seems to be going back and forth between the chorismos and the attempt to overcome it. So on the other hand, in addition to that, I thought that perhaps when we speak of the forms, Goethe was mentioned, and the original phenomena or the original plants, for example, original human beings primordial beings primordial phenomena that he tried to get to. However, in what sense perhaps, and this relates to the question of, are we just choosing arbitrarily certain isms that make sense to us, but that to me itself is weird, that we are even capable of picking and choosing, and what consequence does it have, or are we by that generating what Jean Baudrillard called simulacra? So that's copies without originals. Do you see what I'm trying to say? When we speak of the forms, and I did think that there is something that is because one of the dialogues that I published on my channel, I entitled "The Return of the Forms" quite boldly, because I thought that this is what's coming out of it. And I still would think that. However, I would also like to be careful myself with how we in what kind of relationship we really actually stand with the tradition, and how we can deliver it over to this our epoch, or the shock of the future. I saw that you're speaking at that one, so but that to me is one of my that's basically my question, is what's the role of the tradition? Do we have any relationship with it at all? Is it, if we have one, can it be a real one or a genuine one, or is it one that is do we just deal with simulacra at worst case, or is it a genuine relationship that we have? And I think some of your questions, John, that you sent me before are going not in that same direction, but also ask the question, how do we know the forms?
So I'd like to actually just focus on this for our discussion, your point. Whatever, I have self-criticisms, but they're I think you're right. I think they are nested within this larger question. I have questions and concerns about, how do we bring it? But this is something that I think I see Plato wrestling also within the dialogues. How do you know when you're doing it well?
Yeah.
How do you know when you're doing it poorly? What's the relationship between these practices and the cultivation of wisdom? And I see Plato genuinely raising these questions. And I thought, to your point, if I want to have a proper loyalty, and I think that's the way I'm going to frame what I'm going to begin to answer your challenge, your very good question. If I have proper loyalty to Plato, we need to bring up those questions. Now, thankfully, we're not bringing them up in abstraction, because there's a whole set of emerging practices, some of which I've helped to co-create, and discussions with people also converging on this, like John Rusin and others, to give us foils that we can work with. But I think the answer to my question is in some way the way to answer your question. I think if we can enter into something very much like the self-criticism we see exemplified in Plato about Platonism, that we are being loyal. That's part of the broader response. I'm not saying it's an answer to be initiator of discussion. I think the difference between the simulacra and belonging to a tradition is one of fidelity. It is not one of accuracy or precise repetition. That would be ridiculous, because that would cut Plotinus out of the Platonic tradition, which I think is an indication that our normative standards are too high or incorrectly placed. And it also doesn't mean that we agree with everything that's developed, or the newest developments or the best developments. When you have fidelity or loyalty to someone, it means you keep returning back to them and letting them correct you. I'm thinking of the model of a genuine relationship, where you're maintaining a fidelity to a person. It means you commit to letting them transform you so that you conform to them. So part of the way I would say I feel that I'm engaged with the origin is that I continually return to Plato in discussion, in practice, and I'm transformed by it. But I think there's an important way in which there's been a lacuna in this, is that we have not explicitly brought up this question of returning to Plato via self-correction.
Thank you.
Did you want to say something, Johannes? You
I want to hear. I always want to say something, but that's why the mute button is a very good invention by Zoom. So Daniel, you go.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I will not. Yeah, I will. As John, I've prepared something, but you've opened now a completely different topic, Johannes, which is also fine. On that, where can I begin? Like, we have a very strange, I mean, this is, I guess, the problem, right? This the problem of the metaphysical supermarkets, as we've sometimes called it, that we treat the tradition. So we take that and we take that. And it's all a little bit confused and often discombobulated. And that's I think a danger we can fall into. However, I think one of our main tasks in our time, I see John is wrestling with this constantly, is to recover rationality. Something that also Plato is really struggling with. So I think if we have, and I mean, since Kant is already, and Hegel, and then after that, they all kind of, I mean, Heidegger, then we have a very strong criticism of reason. But I think that we can have a good commitment and to Plato, and also the proper humility, if we adopt, for example, what the medieval mystics called docta ignorantia, or learned ignorance.
Yes.
Because I think that if we really get that right within the bounds of rationality or reason, then we can also move our way through thinking in such a way that there is something like a mechanism or like of self-correction. I believe, and we don't fall into the pitfalls where we just argue with kind of like instrumental rationality, or just trying to reason for the sake of argument. So this coupling of reason, first of all, also then to really the bounds, the limits of rationality, but then also to something great. I think in your talk, Rationality and Ritual, John, you also talked this about with Tillich, that rationality is never cold calculation, but always connected to love, to emotion. So this is, I think, for me, part of the recovery, so we can perhaps have again a more proper relation to Plato, and that we don't fall into this pitfall of just having it as a kind of standing reserve and kind of like an assembly of simulacra that we use.
Yeah, I mean, I just started last night, 3 hours and 3 hours every night for the rest of this week with Robert Breedlove, and we're going through Plato's Critique of Impure Reason together and creating a podcast and video series around it. I think you're exactly right, Daniel. For me, that's the central thing. If I had to put it in a phrase, I'm trying to inventio and reinventio dialogical rationality as the cultivation of wisdom. And I think that is a proper and defensible reading of a important central aspect of Plato. And I return to Plato again and again, both for inspiration and correction on what that can look like, not only in terms of the practice, but in the exemplary case of Socrates as someone who has committed themselves to that.
Could we go as far as saying that as soon as we deal with the question of eidos, even in translation now, of course, that we have to figure that one in as well. But as soon as that's at stake, eidolon, so a ghost or a spirit. So the eidolon is a subform, let's say, of eidos that also Plato has to grapple with. So
Yes.
as soon as the eidos, the form, appearance, etc., are at stake, the eidolon, so also the shadow, by the way, comes into play, as we know from the cave, and the eidolon as the ghost or as the phantom, we could say, or we would say, not Plato wouldn't say this, but we could perhaps also translate eidolon as a demonic or so spirit in a non-Greek sense.
Yes.
So that perhaps is always already, so appearance and shadow, being and seeming, or being an illusion. In German there, by the way, also phonetically very close, sein und sein. So they almost sound the same, right? And what only the English can, of course, say something very interesting also. This appears to be, or this seems to be, this strange connection between the two, this bringing together of seeming and being, and to allow for, this is at least what I've heard, I want to say a dialectics, but a mediation or a movement between being and illusion. Not to say that there's no distinction. There is one, I think, that would have to be articulated, but so that even that's what's in the abstract, even something that is can also begin to turn into a semblance of itself, and hence then only be an illusory or mere appearance, a shadow of itself, as we say of someone, he's become a shadow of himself. So that's what I've heard now. This is going in that direction, so that maybe there is a threat of a simulacrum, but that has, in a different way, in a different language, always been there as soon as the question of appearance and being, as soon as those questions have come up. And you tied those, both of you, I think, to practice, to phronesis, to practical wisdom, to an actual enactment.
Yes.
And if without that, then perhaps we fall into shadows or so. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and I think this is where the convergence with Rusin and other people, this is why I think bringing phenomenology back to Plato, because one of the ways of understanding phenomenology, that which shines forth, is the proper, finding the proper relation, ratio and religio, between appearance and reality. So there's that element of discernment in phronesis, insofar as phronesis affords Sophia. Sophia, I think, is the worldview that emerges from proper phronesis. And to my mind, it's not only the phenomenology, it's this comes out of the phenomenological tradition, but it's about trying to wrestle deeply with this distinction between the hermeneutics of beauty, the way D.C. Schindler argues for it, and the hermeneutics of suspicion, the way Ricoeur warns us. And so, again, I don't think those as orthogonal or projections onto Plato. I think they are ways of bringing tools, I think, directly inspired by Plato, back to bear on exactly this central issue in Plato. And so all the practices are like they have as part of their function to bring about a, I want to call like an excellence, a virtue, an integration of belief and states of consciousness and character and fluid intelligence, such that we have that, we can enact that discernment on an ongoing basis. So again, I think that is a way of being loyal to the issue that arises. This is why I'm engaging in these. I'm not trying to defend myself. I'm trying to say, I take seriously what you're saying, and this is right. And that's why I'm also talking with people about these emerging ghosts and daemons and spirits that emerge whenever you're doing some kind of dialogical distributed cognition. It's exactly towards that issue, is how within this process of dialogical rationality do we discern, right? Do we discern the daemon from the demonic, if I could use that contrast? And I think this is a real question that concerns me. And the problem we face with Plato, one of the problems, is there's an incompleteness in the text, right? And I don't mean the deliberate incompleteness about the aporia. I mean, we forget that the academy was situated beside the gymnasium. These are people who had fought in war, right? There's all kinds of stuff going on around, and Plato constantly alludes to it, especially in the Republic. I want this kind of training. I want this kind of training, right? And so there's all this stuff that's missing, I think, because it was just culturally presupposed by Plato. And we can't reconstruct that because we can't go back to ancient Athens. So we have to do something that is anachronistic, but hopefully thoughtfully. So, which is, well, what set of practices can we wrap around this so that we can get something that will, help guard the discourse the way all these other things around the discourse and the dialogue guarded it for Plato. And so I find myself constantly looking for what I can make a good case are the functional equivalents, but nevertheless appropriate to our time. Like I try to acknowledge the anachronism, but I try to be as loyal to Plato as I can, while realizing and acknowledging that anachronism.
Well, in some sense, but this is, I wouldn't even say it's necessarily an anachronism, because my question is that we have a relationship with the tradition. The question is, if nothing is at stake in that relationship, if we are not at stake in it, if it's purely Plato argues for this ism, but Aristotle refutes that ism, then it's, do you see that to me, so is then that's what I would say is it's against time, because it or it warps time, because it generates this weird distance relationship.
I understand.
Also, at the same time, something that's also awkward about our epoch is that we have everything at disposal. But if we are ourselves at stake in this, let's say in the practices, etc., and it could lead to, you mentioned a demonic appearance or so, that this is just to say that something uncanny can take over a dialogue. That is not necessarily, no one's really leading it anymore at some point.
Yes, which is what I want.
As I experienced with you a few months ago. So that's what that's, to me, it's not necessary, it's not against time, that's actually with time. That would be a playful way of engaging with the time in which we are, which is because I don't have to tell this the author of The Meaning Crisis, but as you know, there is a genuine collapse that's occurring, or to quote Heidegger, the collapse has already occurred. It's just now a question of how it plays out over the next decades. And he says this in the 50s or 60s or so. And it's so in that moment of categories collapsing, this is a maybe not the best way of putting it, but what is necessary to be delivered over into that which is now emerging?
Excellent, excellent. And so I want to transpose the functionality of how Plato responded to a meaning crisis, a collapse of religion and socio-political organization,
Of
even
myth. Sorry.
myth and yes, yes. And I want to see to what degree that can be transposed into our situation in order to address the meaning crisis. I do the same thing as I draw from that tradition from drawing from the Hellenistic period that was confronting a kind of cultural domicide. And I also see what transposes from there. So that's what's at stake for me. If Plato can't save our souls, there's a sense in which I'm not interested. Now, I happen to have a faith in the sense of fidelity, not the assertion of unevidenced beliefs. But I happen to have faith that Plato has that promise, or to putting it another way, in my lived relationship with the text, I find that promise is constantly being kept. And for me, that is how I'm at stake. And it's how I am also putting a normative demand on how I'm reading Plato and trying to question him.
Yeah, Daniel, thank you.
I just would like to sum up the challenges that you brought up, Johannes, just to rephrase them. So because you brought up many challenges. The first one I think I heard is, how can we discern between really the form and just the simulacrum or an eidolon? How do we do that? That's one thing. Then the other thing is also how, and that's I think what John was initially in the email bringing up. How do we recognize when we are really on the path to the forms and not into some bullshit, where we take into eidolon, shadow imagery, I don't know, some delusion, and that's a second challenge. And then another challenge that I heard is how do we not turn the tradition into kind of like an assembly of eidolons, because that's this great danger I think that comes with Heidegger, that we see everything from the historical balcony, because in very strange ways we have now a different stance to the tradition, kind of like from outside of it, but still inside this very strange condition we find ourselves in postmodernity. So that's another challenge. So really, I mean, I personally think that when we attune ourselves with care or love, so philia, to what we are doing, to reality, then I think we can at least steer or learn to steer between those pitfalls. That's at least the answer I often get from. So let's maybe just to make this point a little bit stronger. DC Schindler, for example, argues that knowing the form is knowing the intimate reality of a thing. Knowing, Nishitani somewhere says, knowing reality from within, so to say. Getting so learning from the pine tree, the koto of the pine tree, learning from the bamboo, the koto of the bamboo, kind of like getting really the thing as it is in itself. Zu den Sachen selbst, perhaps, as we would say with Husserl. So, and for me, this is really then tied to care or to love. And I see this really strong in Christian thinkers as well, that they bring rationality in context with something like agapic love. So that seems to me that's one way to so that rationality again is not self-asserting itself, but is kept in a kind of healthy relationship with itself, something like that. this is at least also the answer that Nishitani, for example, proposes to that problem, coming from outside of the Western tradition. He's really emphasizing that point with agape. As one genuine answer to avoid the problem of being and seeming, and that we fall into a relationship where we just treat everything just as idols, or perhaps not John, we could add from idol to icon. So this distinction that we do not treat our reality as a collection of idols, but as kind of like iconic, as where we have portals for transformation and aspiration, and knowing things as they are and reality as it is.
I think you muted, Johannes.
Sorry. Idol comes from eidolon. So they hang together. And so briefly on, Heidegger was mentioned, briefly on care. So perhaps, who knows, but perhaps one of the tasks, mandates is also to find our own translations then also, however. This is something that Heidegger begins of these texts. There are scholastic translations or musings about Plato and Aristotle, most dominantly, of course, Thomas Aquinas, etc. Those are written in Latin and Latinized versions or translations of the Greek. Perhaps it is, but that's their time, as it were, perhaps not necessarily still only ours as well. So perhaps one of the tasks would be also to retranslate, but at the same time be aware that not everything can be translated, and that Plato, you mentioned the cultural, social context of the polis and everything around it, that can't be, that would turn it into a simulacrum, right? I think that would be at least a simulation if we try to reenact that. And at the same time, if we assume that we can translate everything and understand everything. What was mentioned briefly, by the way, I want to recommend this book. It was recommended to me by Bogdan Minka. This is The Origins of European Thought by Onions, published by Cambridge. And I learned from this book, for example, that telos does not mean end, but really, first of all, allotted time.
Oh.
So the telos of something is its allotted time. And here on phronesis or phronein, the verb that is at the root of phronesis. In later Greek, phronein has primarily an intellectual sense, to think, have understanding. But in Homer, it is more comprehensive, covering undifferentiated psychic activity, the action of phronesis involving emotion and conation. So, for example, an approximate translation could be, for one of these sentences here that I won't read in Greek, their spirits pressed forward and lusted for battle. So phronesis is really directly related then to also not just having understanding, but conation, emotion, feeling. And perhaps there's something to be, one shouldn't resurrect the dead, but perhaps to rediscover, recover the works in light of a language that speaks to us more than the standard translations of essentia, substantia, essence, substance, etc. And find not a new, but a language that is, and it would probably be mostly English, I would think, as being the lingua franca of the world. So at one, and then in terms of care, with a careful, slow attitude towards it, and an appreciation that not everything will be recoverable and understandable.
I think that's an excellent proposal, and you exemplify this exceedingly well, my friend. And so I think that is one thing you have regularly brought to these dialogues. And I think that concern is important. I want to say two things, sort of hopefully tying the two things together. I think the care towards the text and the tradition is inseparable from the care of people. This is exactly the case in the Christian Platonic tradition, the Daniel Zaruba. These people who are writing these seminal texts are not academics the way we are. They were often bishops and monks and priests, and they were invested, and I want to read a lot into that word, they were invested in the care of, right, the spiritual sapiential care of persons in community. And I think for me, that's another criterion I use. If these translations translate into genuine caring of persons in community, I also take that as a mark that I'm being loyal to the tradition, because in the end, that's also, I think, the Platonic eros into Neoplatonic Christian agape. Now, in connection with that, I'm wondering, Johannes, about something that I do. You reach back in those etymologies, and I think that is very important to do. I try to connect some of these ideas to emerging theoretical terms from cognitive science, dynamical systems ideas, which are in a literal sense anachronistic to Plato. But the reason I do that is precisely because of what I previously said. It often helps me translate into people's cognition in a way that alters their cognition, something about Plato, where if I state it from the tradition, it just hits them as the dead hule, the dead wood of terms that they just assemble in their mind and gather together. So sometimes I'm trying to do the, what Tolkien called the recovery. I'm trying to go something outside and then come back and use that to see the tradition to come to terms in both senses of the word with the tradition in a way that helps me translate it so that it becomes dynamically challenging to people rather than just dead possession. And that's another, I guess that's another criterion I look for. Is it right? And I think you're doing the same thing, by the way, with the etymology. The etymology wakes people up, right, to the fact that they've lost, and I do that too, right? But you do it really well. That we've lost something in the term. So I think I want to propose to you another criteria that reaches both back and out, right, of a coming to terms. A genuine wrestling with coming to terms that translates into care for persons in community as another criterion we use in order to guide our self-evaluation, our self-correction.
Yeah.
It gets down to a certain point where I can't, and maybe this is a failing, I don't know, but maybe I don't care about the feeling, so maybe this is a fault of mine. Like, if in some Cartesian God space, I'm getting Plato wrong, it's like, yeah, but if this reading is intellectually defensible and translatable and does this and addresses the meaning crisis, and it's like, I'm not so sure I care about that Cartesian accuracy. I don't prioritize it over everything we've been talking about here. Because for me, that's the nature of a tradition. The tradition is not accurate repetition. It is careful and continuous reconstruction.
All I would add for now is that whatever perhaps should remain in place, though, is, to repeat myself, is also a dimension of strangeness, however.
Yes, so that, I agree.
See,
yes.
So we don't attack, because it could lead to two things. Either say, oh, Plato knew everything what we know today, he just said it differently. Or
Yeah.
the other extreme, which I've heard very often from very young students, which has made me lose a lot of hope, was, why do I read Aristotle? He was wrong on everything in physics.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe, who knows? I don't know, but there would be no physics without Aristotle.
Right.
And so those are those two extremes that could lead to, if we just make it all too, say, all too easily accessible.
Yes.
So you said in the etymology, there's an awakening up to, but that, you know, you can wake someone else up, but they have to, you can wake them up when they're physically sleeping, I mean, but they would still have to accept that they're awake.
Yes.
And then you cannot really make someone stand up or get up. I mean, you can try, but it's going to be excruciatingly painful for everyone. And so I think so that waking up still, that there's something, what comes alive is precisely what comes alive is that which is not available in the translation, that which still, that dimension, I think, needs to be not you know, placed as a condition, but needs to be understood that
No, I think it is a condition. I think it's a real condition. I don't think you should back away from that. I was trying to put my finger on it, but I think you've said it better, that the translation always has to be the care, that the care is always a calling to transformation, a challenge to people in some way. But you can, and so I like what you just said, and it goes to the point. Like, what I mean is, it goes to the point phenomenologically. If we get a taste of this uncanniness, it will help us in discerning the uncanniness within the practice between the daimonic and the demonic. I think what you just said is a deep principle of praxis. If we can cultivate the taste, almost in the Kantian sense, the taste of the Platonic uncanny, and have a deep reverence for it, that can help actually, you know, guide our discernment, so we can taste the difference between the daimonic and the demonic. I think that is actually, I want to push back a bit. I think it is a condition. I think it is an important constraint on anything we're doing here.
Condition as constraint?
Yes.
Okay. Condition as sets from the a priori? No. That,
No,
you know, that's
no. Yes. I meant as constraint. I meant as a constraint on viable translation.
Yes, and yes, it's the uncanny, if you like, that speaks then to us. It's that's which opens up.
Yes.
And that's maybe also how, because the simulacrum gives you everything.
Yes.
It's all there. It's Disneyland is the simulacrum, you know, of
yes. It's a totalization
of old.
Yes.
But it's all there. Here's your milkshake. Here's your super fun park, whatever. I've never been, so what do I know? But there's nothing, as it were, uncanny. Where it becomes uncanny in Disneyland is when you see Mickey Mouse take off the mask. And they take off the hat. It's, all of a sudden, something real cuts through and destroys everything.
Yes.
So the uncanny actually destroys it, whereas here the uncanny is a constraint on making or it is the uncanny that lets us see anything, or it also lets us see something profoundly important, maybe like that. Yeah.
That was really good, Johannes. One thing on your point, because I've followed this, you know, the same discourse, a similar discourse is going on also in the Christian tradition.
Yes.
So, for example, there are coming out a lot of translations recently, for example, of the New Testament. I'm reading now the David Bentley Hart translation of the New Testament, and that, for example, that brings out some of, for example, the Sermon of the Mount, or even the Our Father, the prayer. It comes up with a very different tone.
Weird.
That is, and for example, David Bentley Hart is doing this precisely because the Christian tradition has, I don't know, is in great trouble today. Let's put it like that. so and then maybe that's also one thing that maybe you want to look into that as a further on this question, because they are also struggling with that, how to translate now the text.
We are continuing our dialogue here. We had to pause it for about 2 or 3 days because we had a scheduling conflict. We're now back. John is wearing the same shirt, and two of us aren't. So, but we're continuing in the same spirit. And John has a few remarks, and afterwards, Daniel.
Yeah, I want to pick up on this theme that we were at the end before we took the break of making one of the ways of being loyal to Plato in trying to recover dialogical rationality for addressing our meaning crisis was to preserve, conserve, but also inventio, discover the uncanniness in the text. So it has that capacity to be, a source of challenge and transformation for us. And then I propose the idea that there can be like a practice around that tutors us in the uncanniness, the Platonic uncanniness, and that the cultivation of that taste, that sensibility transcendence, will afford us the ability to discern between the emergence of the demonic, that is, the hungry specter through the supermarket of simulacra, and the daemonic, which is the phenomenological religio that is binding us to each other and to reality in a way that is conducive to human well-being and the cultivation of wisdom. Now, what that reminds me of is the idea of, the interpenetration, again, a Platonic theme, the interpenetration of the uncanny and the rational, which we, of course, especially post-Freud, have diametrically divided and opposed to each other. But of course, divine madness, Socrates consults his dreams. There is the oracle. There's the Socrates' daemonium, his divine sign. And so Plato is at pains to constantly weave the uncanny and the dialogically rational together. He talks about the experience of the forms as often having this bright strangeness to them. He compares people who have been talking to Socrates as if they are bewitched or as if they've been stung by a stingray. So all of this is in Plato, this interweaving. And this reminds me of work I've been recently doing about trying to integrate our understanding of rationality, reason, with ritual as the education of the imaginal sensibility. And I gave a talk on that at Cambridge. And this project of interweaving the educated imaginal with the rational so as to produce ongoing masterpieces of practice that people can return to again and again to keep the numinous and the uncanny of the corpus alive. I would propose that's a test. Also, if we're going in the right direction, if we can generate rituals from the Platonic corpus, that would mean we're not doing simulacra, but we are actually engaged. And again, lest that's seen as something weird to be imposing on the tradition, Ilinka Tanosio Dobler's book, Theurgy in Late Antiquity, The Invention of a Ritual Tradition, she's basically arguing that the theurgia that became predominant in Neoplatonism, especially post-Iamblichus, all the way through to Proclus and Damasius, and then taken up by Dionysius, pseudo-Dionysius if you have to, right? That this was actually invented, but in the sense of inventio. It was this creation of a whole set of transformative rituals for deeply internalizing the Platonic corpus. And I'm really playing with that word, if you hear what I'm doing with it, incorporating that, embodying it, so that Neoplatonism was able to deal with the collapse that was occurring in later antiquity and the challenge of emerging Christianity. And so I think I want to propose to you that when people are willing to take up ritual dialogical practices for transformation in loyalty to the Platonic text, that is another way in which we can get a training of discernment for avoiding the specters in the supermarket of the simulacra. So that's a proposal I want to make.
Thank you. Daniel.
Okay. That was, first of all, that was really, really good, John. I really liked that. So there was I've just seen a little bit, there was a conversation, actually, I think that was uploaded in between when we were talking between Jonathan Peugeot and Ian McGilchrist.
Yes.
And I think they were alluding to that people, when you ask people today that they don't really believe in something, in a kind of moreness.
Yes.
Although then when you ask them very vaguely, ambiguously, do you think there is something more? Do you have an intimation of something? Then almost 95% say yes.
Yes.
And I think this comes to the point, John, that you've been recently making, that we have this hermeneutics of suspicion in which we comport ourselves to reality. So we don't let that uncanniness, that strangeness, we don't let that really into us. We just push it away, and we don't want to face it in a sense. So they're the hermeneutics of beauty, I think. So that's one thing I think that can help us in order to aspire through these dimensions of brightness and madness, that all can also disclose beauty to us, and a kind of inexhaustible beauty. Now, for me, when you said ritual and rationality, I would just like to throw that in from the Zen tradition, because I see them in a sense also grappling with a similar problem.
Yes.
For example, with, let's say, when we talk about the great doubt, there's always this dimension of doubting, in a sense, confronting and being suspicious about reality. But through that great doubt, we arrive at the point where we can then affirm the suchness, the beauty of the world. Mm-hmm. And that's going through, I think, is achieved through a kind of learned ignorance, as Suksana Nishitani is proposing it. That also, although for me it's still unclear now when we talk about it, how it's exactly that learned ignorance helps us to keep us not to, that we kind of that we want to keep engaging in this hermeneutical process, mm-hmm. that we want to keep doing that we want to, so to say, continue the anagogical process. But I see both traditions wrestling with similar problems here.
Well, I want to answer that in that. I've been going with Robert Breedlove through D.C. Schindler's Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, and we were wrestling with just that issue, and Schindler's wrestling with it. I think in chapter 3 on the visible and invisible. If that's right, I can't remember which chapter, we're going over all of them. But so there's a sense, and this is an argument I'm going to make in the series in depth and historically and philosophically in an integrated fashion. So I'll just gesture towards it here, a sort of promissory. But I want to argue that the Socratic declaration of wisdom consists in knowing what one does not know, is developed and reaches its culmination in some sense in the Neoplatonic proposal of learned ignorance. And then what I would want to say is that what learned ignorance does is it's a cataphatic and apophatic way of ritually enacting, and Plato emphasizes, although we have to talk about it sequentially, it's happening simultaneously. He explicitly says that, ritually enacting the procession and the return. Let me try and do this with the parable of the cave and the sun. Well, let's just concentrate on that part of it. So Schindler makes this point that what we do is we use the analogy between the sun and the visible things and the sun and the living things. Remember, the sun is both the source of light and life, right? So we use that double relationship, and then we use that as an analogy to try and understand the good as the ground of intelligibility, that which provides the light of intelligibility and the energy required for intelligibility. But then Schindler says, if you just do the ascent from, right, the image, you haven't understood it, because what you then have to do is you have to realize, oh, but the sun itself and life itself are actually, right, grounded in the good. And so what happens is you get a movement where you go from the image to what can't be imaged, and then you return from that to the image. So there's both the ascent and the descent, like the cave, right? And then in that, but again, we're talking about it sequentially, but when it happens simultaneously, that is the state of learned ignorance, because here's the learning, and then here's the realization of the ignorance. And then the point is, I would argue on E.C. Schindler's behalf, the point I made is that's also Spinoza's scientia intuitiva, right? I think you can make a good case that that's prajna, right? The whole and the part, all of that. That for me, that is the fundamental, this is the best word I have. That's the fundamental grammar of intelligibility. And if that fundamental grammar of intelligibility is not wedded to the fundamental grammar of reality, we are doomed.
Yeah.
We are doomed. Right? And so, right, that, so, but if we take the promise, and that promise is the good, that's what the good is, that wedding will never end, that marriage will never divorce, then learned ignorance is the state of conformity, reverential, faithful conformity to the good and to the intelligibility that is wedded through it to being. That's my answer to your question, Daniel.
So I'll say, it's when John just said we are doomed, that's to be taken in a literal sense.
Yeah. Yes. Right. I had thought about that. Yes.
Because it means it means the collapse of the world.
Yes.
It means apocalypse. Not as revelation, but apocalypse in the sense of complete and total collapse and breakdown. And this, the Greeks already suffered through this. John, you alluded to this at the beginning. Beginning of this recording, so about 10-15 minutes ago, so I think you mentioned the meaning crisis as already occurring during the times of Plato. The disappearance of myth. The Greeks aren't young children. They're not it's not a golden age. Philosophy arises for two main reasons, because myth collapses, and because the sophists or sophistry takes the place and, for example, sells virtue without knowing what virtue is and cannot answer what virtue is in itself. Hence the arisal of the Platonic dialogues that want to get to the concept and the idea, the principle itself, and to the good. There's something else I want to stress, which is binding to reality. Just by association, the unboundedness of Prometheus unbound, to quote Shelley, is so. This, we don't have to go down this path. I just like to mention, why is it that Prometheus, the Titan Prometheus, without his brother Epimetheus, by the way, makes a comeback in modernity. The Titanic. Ernst Jünger says somewhere, and I don't know where exactly, I forgot, that it's the Titans are chaos. This is simplified, and the Olympians are the gods of order. And we live more now in a Titanic age, and so binding to reality means to be there's a sense of limitation, but also importantly, without this being bound to, we are doomed, just to repeat what you said. And that's to be taken in an absolute literal sense. That's the reason why philosophy begins, is because the world collapses. There's a collapse between thinking and being already in this time. And the attempt by Plato, and now I have to ask a somewhat critical question. The way in which Plato introduces his, say, solution or response to this occurrence of the collapse of thinking and being, which for Parmenides is still present and there. Hence the same is togar auto noen kaenai, is thinking and being. This collapse occurs, and the horizon, while Plato tries to, and you use the word, I think, marriage, or by binding together. So I use these words also to marry them together, to wed them back together, which is exactly, by the way, also the project of German idealism. They try to do just this. Kant in his way, Fichte in his way, Hegel in his way. And however, so we can see that this is a long collapse, if you like. It's a long movement of decadence that also has moments of a new flourishing. But the way in which Plato tries to solve for this in quotation marks, it tries to respond to this, is such that it does introduce a chorismos. So the thread of the two worlds is there in Plato, even though, of course, there is the higher form of Plato's thinking, which is the Parmenides dialogue, which I'm, by the way, increasingly thinking, just to mention this, that we three should read, and try and wrestle with it, and then try and see what happens. But so the chorismos, this differentiation between two worlds is there, at least in principle, let's say. And hence Aristotle, who's, as everybody knows, is a student of Plato, knows this, sees this, and attacks Plato precisely for this. So we cannot, I think, disregard this, what has sustained the entire history or development and unfolding of Western thought, which led to the Universalienstreit. I think in English it's a universals controversy in American English. So the struggle between the nominalists and the realists, which, and now it's such a dead end in academic philosophy that all that people can come up with is either we've given up. So there's a book by Peter Unger, which is Empty Ideas, which says basically analytical philosophy is over. And the other side, which is more continental, comes from Italy and Germany with a movement that calls itself New Realism. And you see, when to me at least, when something has to announce itself as new, it is maybe not that new, and it's just another attempt to say, look, there is still something here that we can say something to the real, because so the project is similar. It's trying to bind itself to reality, but I think so. So the Cordismos, I think we have to take seriously this threat of the two world split.
Yes.
And then binding to reality how this occurs, the uncanny, etc. That's I think we need more on this. And one more question on, so I understand inventio better, because inventio could mean invention, and invention could mean to make something up, or to dream it up, or to fantasize. But so did I hear you right that you said it's more to do with discovery, or
it's both. So inventio in that sense is trying to be a term to designate what occurs within full participation. And I mean participation in a very Platonic sense, right? It's not making, and where you just impose, and it's not discovery in which it is just disclosed to you. And so the analogy, which is a Platonic one, is love. You don't impose it on a person, and you do not merely discover it in them or from them. You participate with them in it. And of course, that is an ongoing Platonic theme. That's how that's how Carey uses the word inventio when he talks about Augustine's inventio of the human self.
Yeah.
It's that, and that's how the intent I want to use. I want to say that your question challenge is yeah, I'll be bold here. It's almost a methodological criterion for me. Anything in Plato that points to that or supports the two worlds myth is something that I reject. Now, I want to say, and being loyal to somebody doesn't mean accepting everything from them. It means appropriately rejecting also. And that's the challenge, because how do we do accepting and rejecting in a disciplined manner that is not just picking and choosing from the supermarket? And so you're revivifying your challenge and making it even more profound, which I appreciate. I would say that I think that tradition, this is an argument I've made, and I've made it at length. I think the tradition, and there's a sense in which you can see it starting with Aristotle, in which the good is reduced from what we've been talking about here to something like the principle of non-contradiction. And you see the beginning of logos being taken into or reduced to logic. And then contemplative rationality is going to be reduced to computational rationality, which is then going to be reduced to communicative rationality. And part of what I want to say is what I think one of the great gifts of the third wave of Platonic scholarship, Gonzalez, Highland, all these people, is the argument about the important, if not central, role of the non-propositional within Plato. This is why I'm emphasizing the ritual so much. And this is why I reject the idea of the eidos as an essence in the Aristotelian, maybe not from Aristotle, but the Aristotelian tradition of the set of necessary and sufficient conditions, because that's propositional. It's propositional and conceptual.
Essence is a definition.
Yes.
Essentia in Aquinas, at least in the Ente et Essentia, is a definition, which so again is and specify. I mean, just sorry to throw it in.
It can, but it could also mean definition in the sense of delimiting, which isn't the same thing as setting out logical, necessary, and sufficient conditions, right? And so, but regardless, what I mean is, one of the reasons why I think we have to rethink the forms outside of a lot of this tradition is because we have thought of the forms within a propositionally centric frame throughout, and yet sorry, you can respond to that in a sec, Johannes, because I know you want to challenge it.
I'm sorry.
It's okay, but right, to the degree to which we can recover the Platonic emphasis on the non-propositional and Socrates as exemplifying wisdom but never defining it, which is a really important theme through many of the dialogues, is, I think, a way in which we can move to a genuine, I want to say something like the grain, the line of the in a grain of wood, right? The grain in a line of wood. We can within Plato, the emphasis of the non-propositional, which I think undermines and allows us within Plato to challenge the temptation of the two worlds mythology. And his attitude towards it, of course, is very playful, very, very playful. And so it's a place in which we can engage in serious play. And once again, just to bring it around, and then I'll shut up so you can, because I know you're bursting, both of you, that's why, again, independently recovering the deep interpenetration of the rational and the ritual is a way of trying to enact and not just theorize about this way of recovering in Plato what can free us from the threat of the two worlds. So there, that's my initial reply.
That's very good. And a very brief question. Would that have to take into consideration the entire tradition that, so we can't just push that aside? Would be
No.
Controversy, and also then actually the destruction by Kant of any sort of that traditional metaphysics or ontology, and the attempt to get back to things in themselves, etc., through Hegel. So that's to me the question: is this spoken from the position of, say, Platonism, whatever the word, or universalism, or realism? Realism used to be the technical term. Or is this completely outside and trying to overturn from within?
I'll just say something brief and then I'll let Daniel speak.
Yeah.
The way I practice it is I try to listen for the non-propositional in all these arguments, contrary to how people like Hegel and were taught to me, right? Which is, here's the arguments, right? Here's the logic, here's the argument. I try to listen for that. And then I also try to see the unacknowledged at times hunger for ritual in what they are doing. Like when I see the early Hegel saying he wants a philosophy that can also be a religion, and a religion that can also be a philosophy, it's like, yeah, I get that, but you can't do that just by writing. And I have this slogan that I use with people: don't tell me what you believe, tell me what you practice. And I want to be able to ask Hegel, what would you practice, and what would that mean? Because I know you're reaching towards something, but it's not clear to me that it's getting resolved, as opposed to always being, almost in a Derridian sense, marginalized, but nevertheless threatening the center of the text. So that's how I try to read that tradition, and to varying degrees of success. I mean, you can see it, especially, you can see it easily still there, like in Descartes. He's doing all this computational stuff, but he calls it the Meditations because he's trying to invoke Marcus Aurelius, right? And it's like, what are you doing? Like, what's going on there? Like, or Spinoza writing this, computational thing that looks like a computer program, but he ultimately says, but in the end, reason depends on love, and you have to leap into scientia intuitiva, right? And he's doing all that. So I'm not trying to be dodgy or Canadian. I don't want to reject the tradition, but I'm not just simply following it. I'm trying to use a term I use frequently, not my term, but one of the terms I use frequently. I want to try and exact from it as best I can. Now I'll shut up.
Johannes, do you want to respond to with the point on Hegel? No.
No, don't get me started on Hegel, because that's never ending. That's for another time when we have 10 hours. So Daniel, you go ahead.
Yeah, I know. But yeah. I don't even know what to say. The point with, how do we take the tradition? We really have to, in this what you said in the last minutes, I think we just have to acknowledge the peculiar necessities of our time. And John alluded to it, logos reduced to a kind of computational logic, and often philosophy as it's taught today, often reduced to just argumentation and rationality, just, descending more and more into really things that are just irrational. And I think that to respond to this need of our age, it's just helpful if we see, okay, how, for example, how did the Neoplatonists do learned ignorance? How did, I don't know, Nicholas of Cusa or Meister Eckhart did this?
Yep.
How did they respond to this need? And we can also see, okay, because also, Johannes, right, we know of certain dangers that perhaps someone like Plato couldn't know of, possibly, or the tradition, because the tradition was just enveloped in this Christian worldview, which we aren't today. But I still think that this is more and more the sense I'm getting, that we can really learn from the tradition. Because one thing, for example, that I think hasn't changed is how this problem between the one and the many, or the parts and the whole. This is still something that we are wrestling today with. So, although I don't hear it so much, and there I think that the initial proposal that John made, coming from Schindler, as kind of learned ignorance as this simultaneous acknowledgement or holding together, or also participating both with the one and the many, I think that's very, very good, and it's a very strong argument, I think, that one can make in favor of learned ignorance, or a kind of simultaneous praxis and theoria, or ritual and rationality.
Yeah, I want to add to the first part. I think that not only did we get the sort of like the step down from contemplative rationality to computational. That's sort of, I think, the heart of the Enlightenment, because you have the formal system, which it's autonomos, right? It's autonomy as the thing that most matters. But now, in the hands of postmodernism, that is now giving way to communicative rationality. And I don't even know if it deserves to be called rationality anymore, but it's all that's really happening is discourse, open-ended, unlimited, right, discourse. And all we're doing is, how do we manipulate and persuade and get people to cooperate with us, or whatever, which is now very prevalent as an overall framing. I think that every one of those moves is not actually properly justified by convincing argumentation. I think it's been more about, the commitment to a particular framework, and it's the way it's the way it does salience landscaping for people that is so important. I mean, there's that. I think that's what was much more driving this stepping down than, here's a clear argumentation is going on there. But what I mean by that is, you know, the shift to computational rationality, and you know, Hannes mentioned this, and Hannah talks about it very well. It's bound up with the Promethean spirit. This idea, autonomy, the Promethean spirit that we can be completely self-made, and we can completely make ourselves. We don't need, right, constraints. We don't need things. We shouldn't understand our humanity as our you know, sort of in the Heideggerian sense, as a mortality, as you know, we are perpetually finite and perpetually, right, related to the transcendent. No, we can, right? And the Promethean spirit is bound up with that computational model. You can see it because, right, if you have this, you know, Descartes says, if you do it right, there's nothing you can't do. There's nothing you can't know. And it's like, wow. And then what we get now is we get the flavor of, well, actually, right, there's so much hermeneutic suspicion. There's so much that's always going on around the margins and behind the scene and in the unconscious and during power conflicts that, you know, we can't know anything, and we've just swung the other way. And so I'm saying all this because what I'm saying is the relationship to the tradition can't just be one of following the arguments, independently of the point I just made about the importance of the non-propositional. But even the history is not driven just by the chaining of arguments or theories. There's these other things going on.
Yeah, I agree with that completely.
Yeah.
And that's why one of the reasons I think why I brought up the universals controversy, etc., is because I think it needs to be taken into account, but also insofar as it could just always lead back again to the same quarrels of the same isms, between the same isms, if, as you say, we just go back again to just the argument. And I think very important, I want to stress this again, what you just said, is that even if we look at the history of the development or the unfolding, even then we can look back now and neatly pigeonhole it and say it's between the realists and the nominalists. But even that isn't everything, because that would be reductive. It would reduce it to the propositional as well, and that will not have been the case, because it's contextual, situational, got to do with language, etc., and also with simply epochs in which that's what's being fought out. On Prometheus, because he was just mentioned again, Prometheus Unbound, Shelley says explicitly in his own introduction to the poem or the drama, the play, that he wanted to say Prometheus Unbound and rewrite Aeschylus Prometheus Bound, precisely because Prometheus is the great champion of mankind and not the great oppressor. Hence, it would be the suffering of Prometheus must be for something. As people may know, Mary Shelley, wife of Shelley, wrote Dr. Frankenstein with subtitled The Modern Prometheus.
Yes.
Who was able to reach into unexplained why and how the principle of life and grant it to the monster, as it's then referred to, which is not Frankenstein, but that's the doctor, who actually does it. So and it's not electricity that's used to bring life into that monster, but what this principle of life shows is also, I mean, the way in which it's understood is also purely rational. She had extreme foresight. By the way, Goethe's early poem, or even dramatical fragment that we have of Prometheus, Prometheus himself is bound, as he says, by time, and bound by Ananke, by necessity. So there is also this just other current there. Two more things. I think I said this before, but the one and all, the all unifying one, there's a reason why Heidegger begins to say this towards the end of his life. I think he begins to see that there's a strange unification occurring. And there is a unification in the sense that has never occurred before. I'm in London, John, you're in Toronto, Daniel is in Vienna. That mode of dialoguing with each other is completely impossible a few decades ago. It's not impossible 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago because of television, but you needed an entire studio.
Yeah.
Now it's you and I, and anyone else with a laptop and a camera. Well, not even a camera, just a microphone. You don't even need a camera.
No, the thing that's making it all possible is the captured fire of the computer, the fire of the gods in the computer, and that is part of the computational rationality that is making this possible.
Yeah, but it's also releasing other sparks.
And, of course.
At the same time, the all unifying one. This is going to sound very crude. The worst outcome is, and then we're doomed, is a complete collapse into a one-sided oneness of this as a result of this unification. The other possibility is, and that would be to see the genuine then multiplicity and multivocality and of this rhythm coming through rather than collapsing into a metronome.
Well, for me, and again, I'm very grateful to Highland and especially Schindler for this. I think what you just articulated is something that Plato was arguing for, as opposed to the sort of standard two worlds. Schindler emphasizes a lot of things, like the divided line is actually a continuum. It is not a separation. There's just lines on a continuous line. And you ascend, but you also return in the cave. And that I'll use Schindler's language, the relationship between the absolute and the relative. The absolute as absolute, and this will sound like Hegel, I imagine, is not opposed to the relative, but includes it. And that's how it grounds the hermeneutics of beauty as primordial. And so I think, and this is not an accusation, it's an observation. I think you're articulating, again, a Platonic theme here in a deep way. But then my question becomes, how do we, which is the thing my part of self-criticism, how do we actually do that and not just say it? So Daniel, and you and I have talked about this, all three of us have talked about this. Nishitani has a whole set of rituals around the text. You have to be doing mindfulness practices and perhaps even the Eightfold Path, right? There's a whole Zen set of an ecology of practices and rituals around religion and nothingness that, and I've said this before, like you really need to be engaging in them to really get what he's trying to do. And so that's my question is, what do we, like, how do we get the training so that we can find that interpenetration, not just in our discourse, but in our psyche and in our world? That's the thing that I most keep coming back to. And for me, if I fail in that, which is a very real possibility, right, then I will have failed to be faithful, loyal to Plato. That's what I keep coming back to.
I would like to now bring up this point that you mentioned in your email, although it's maybe because we just have 5 minutes, because that's maybe not so good, but maybe it's for another conversation. So Nishitani in his later works, he's really wrestling, as he's doing it in Religion and Nothingness, he's really wrestling with this problem of the one and the many.
Yes.
Because that's underlying, or you could say form and emptiness. That's another way perhaps to phrase this problem. So how do we come into this is also kind of like in our conversation in the last hour, how do we come into a comportment to reality? So we hold ourselves with the right skill and finesse, and also playfulness, I would say, in between ascent and return and ascent, one and many, many and one. And so and I think, John, you were wrestling with this because you were seeing, I think, also in this dialogue you had with Guy and Chris, there's a contradiction kind of like between this self-sameness of kind of one singular being.
Yes.
So this pine tree, this is also called in Zen the stubborn reality of like of the single thing. And then at the other end, so to say, the world, the linkages, that what you call with Uxholder, the Umwelt, that kind of like, there's a contradiction there. So Nishitani also sees in this one late essays, emptiness and sameness, he sees this contradiction. And he says this contradiction surpasses all logic. It's a non-logical sameness.
Yes.
It points to an absolute kind of impossibility. Then he invokes Tertullian, who says credo quia absurdum. I believe because it's absurd or illogical.
Yes.
So for him, he sees there in this problem of the one, the many, he sees actually there's the necessity for religion. And then ultimately that we have to take a leap of faith in addition to the kind of learned ignorance that we also ought to practice. And I think this was also one theme we had in all our dialogues.
Yes.
And the leap of faith and the leap of reason, but that they ultimately point to the same. I think this was also John, your point, John, with DC Schindler.
That's Schindler,
yeah. So that's just one other thing that that I would like to bring up, because I think that's one big challenge, is how we can bring back religion, or the religious traditions and the philosophical traditions. Similar to what you said with Hegel, right? He wants a philosophy that can be a religion and a religion that can be a philosophy.
Yeah.
So this is really also one really important thing that I see.
I want to first of all celebrate the texture and the tenure of the question, because I'll use poetic and provocative language, the quest for God through the ligaments of intelligibility, as being the heart of religion, the self-realizing of reality for its own sake, right? I think that the ability to take that orientation, in Steinberger's sense, the ability to take that orientation and have it work as a fundamental framing for all of one's inner and outer world, trying to speak phenomenologically, not ontologically. I don't know if there's anything beyond that that answers that question, right? So, like, again, I can't, this, and Plato makes this clear, anything I would try to do to convince you of that presupposes it. And then you have to ask yourself, what is it that is holding you back from taking up that fundamental framing? And part of it, I suppose, is, and this is where I see again Plato being valuable, and this is what Schindler is trying to argue, that the ecstasis of love and the ecstasis of reason are interpenetrating, completely interpenetrating, and that if you separate them in the question that refuses to take up that fundamental orientation, then you are basically trying to pretend that you can live without loving anything, which I find so fundamentally dishonest that I cannot understand how anybody could advocate for it. So,
Philosophia
yes, yes, yes,
needs to be brought back again. The
yes,
erotic
yes,
moment.
yes.
Eros is related to the verb that means to ask.
Ah, yeah, right. That's really cool.
So, gentlemen, thank you very much. I'd say to be continued, because
Yes.
we haven't yet gotten to your questions, John, in the
But
email. And that's what we should get to.
But this was excellent. The framing, thank you for this, Johannes, and thank you for your contributions, Daniel. But this framing, Johannes, was excellent. Thank you.